students never remember anything.
I learned the lesson that you can't pay interest when I lend you money.
Good morning, everybody. We're starting this week's Torah portion, Behar, and we're starting from selection from Lekutei Sichot, the first Sicha, the first talk of the Rebbe on Behar. Just an introduction. This week's Torah portion is loaded with commandments. One of the commandments that we study, and it's in today's section on the fifth Aliyah, is do not lend money in interest. I can rent you my car and charge every day. I can rent you my donkey. I can lease you my home, and I can benefit. I cannot lease you or rent you money. Money, it is forbidden to lend with interest. However, to a non-Jew, there is a mitzvah to lend in interest, and part of the reason is to assist them. They're not obligated to borrow, but if they want to borrow, we should charge interest. But we're not dealing with a non-Jew. When God is talking about not lending money in interest, God is giving us a stern warning. It appears several places in the Torah, and in addition, the warning is comparing it to when we left Egypt. In other words, God says, I took you out of Egypt on condition that you do not lend money in interest. And that requires some clarification. And this is the topic of our discussion today. Let's start. Page 431. This week's Torah reading includes the prohibition against giving or taking interest. The prohibition is not just to lend, but also to borrow and also to partake in that transaction as a witness or as someone who signs the loan or is a witness to the loan. Every party to the crime are liable for grave, harsh curse by God. The passage concludes, I am God, your Lord, who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. That's the conclusion of the prohibition of interest. Sifra is a midrash on the book of Leviticus, comments. From this verse, our sages derive the principle that whoever accepts the yoke of the prohibition against charging interest accepts the yoke of heaven. Whoever casts off the yoke of forbidden interest casts off the yoke of heaven. Whoever acknowledges the mitzvah of interest acknowledges the exodus from Egypt. Whoever denies the mitzvah of interest is as if he denies the exodus from Egypt. God says, I am your God who took you out of Egypt to be your Lord. Says the Sifra, if you follow the mitzvah of interest, meaning lending without interest, you accept God's yoke, and you accept the fact that God took us out of Egypt. If you do charge interest, you are denying God as our God, and you're denying that God took us out of Egypt. We must understand, says the Rebbe, why is the prohibition against interest more closely related to the exodus from Egypt and the acceptance of the yoke of heaven than other mitzvot? What is this uniqueness that it's singled out, that it denotes acceptance of God's yoke and the exodus from Egypt? What about Shabbat? What about honoring your father and mother? What about being honest in business? They do not have this, so to say, wrapping around it to say that it's directly related to accepting God's yoke and accepting God took us out of Egypt. Based on the Talmud, Rashi explains, here in this week's Torah portion, on those words, I am your God who took you out of Egypt to be your Lord, Rashi said that at the time of the Exodus, God differentiated between the firstborn and all others, so too he is able to identify and will hold accountable a Jew who lends money to his fellow Jew with interest and claims that the money belongs to a non-Jew. Rashi. This is Rashi. Let's explain. Rashi says, I'm your God who took you out of Egypt, is a reminder to someone who slyly behind the back is charging interest by covering his tracks, so to say. What does he do? He says the money is not mine. It's a deposit by a non-Jew. And therefore it's an interaction, and it's a transaction between you and a non-Jew. Between you and a non-Jew, you're allowed to charge or pay interest. There is no restrictions. Says God, I took you out of Egypt. In Egypt, I knew exactly who to take care of, right? Because they were firstborn that lived in the Jewish homes. They knew they were going to die, so they were hiding in Jewish homes. And there were Jewish firstborn that lived in a non-Jewish home, in an Egyptian home. God knew exactly to pick and choose the right ones. So he does by people who are charging interest, blaming or claiming that it's not their money, but it's the goy's money. God will exact punishment from those people.
But of course God would know that. Why wouldn't God know that? Why is that a big deal?
Huh?
Why is that a big deal?
So that adds to the question. But this is what Rashi, based on the Talmud, says. Why God is adding, I took you out of Egypt? Because when I took you out of Egypt, I first needed to choose firstborn to protect them, right? If you are charging, part of the common sense will answer that charging interest is so easy to do. You have accumulated a nice sum of money, it's sitting in a bank doing nothing. So why wouldn't you let someone else do something with the money and he gives you a part of it? In other words, the challenge of keeping this mitzvah is grave, is very difficult. Sometimes you feel you're doing him a favor because he couldn't start a business without your money. And therefore, you find a loophole. What's a loophole? You say it belongs to my neighbor who's not Jewish. And this way you charge interest. And God says, therefore, be very, very careful. Just a minute. Ali, does that help? Okay. Yes, Raja.
A question. A Jewish-owned bank, meaning that...
I don't want to address interest questions. That's a separate issue. We don't have enough time. We're not going to cover the discussion here. There are we're going to see, there are ways in which we're allowed to, if we are partners in the business. That's where you're going to.
Right,
I don't
okay.
want to talk about scenarios of charging interest now because that requires a whole lesson. We just need to know that you are forbidden from charging interest or paying interest to a Jew, between a Jew and a Jew. If a non-Jew is involved, you are allowed to charge interest, you're allowed to pay interest. The fear is that a man will be tempted to assist his friend, it's his sister, and say, actually, it's not my money, it belongs to a goy. That's why God says, I took you out of Egypt, and over there I knew exactly who to save and who not. Here too, be careful. This insight, however, relates only to one specific circumstance regarding the prohibition against interest, lending with interest. While, just a minute, I need to stop here do something here. Where would I do that? I have to. What it does is it stops. It goes to sleep every.
Me too.
Where is screensaver?
That's right.
Not screensaver. We call it to save.
These are Iron good computers.
You can't live without them. Suddenly my Zoom's not working, it's just not working. Freeze this up. Yeah.
So, somebody can work and says, she's not working.
She's not working.
She's not working.
She's not working. Computers are, she could kill you. Oh yeah, frustrating. They're frustrating. Something just amazing freezes.
Turn off battery when. Turn off display battery when inactive. Never.
There's one that more than 2 Jews ignore.
Okay. Screensaver. Okay. Let's continue. Are we still on, or I lost you?
No,
Are we
you're
still
not
on?
here. Not yet, not yet.
The Rebbe has a problem with this explanation. Why? Says the Rebbe, very simple. This insight, however, relates only to one specific circumstance regarding the prohibition against interest, lending with interest while claiming that the money belongs to a non-Jew. So that's only one case. It's not always the case when someone charges interest. Sometimes they're outright charging interest. Moreover, even in that instance, it does not apply when the lender makes that statement to mislead a human being. That is, if the borrower knew that the money belonged to a Jew, he would not accept the loan, or the court would not allow the loan to be extended. It is applicable only when the lender states that the money belongs to a non-Jew, thinking that God will not make a distinction and recognize that the money belongs to him. As such, he denies the Exodus, at which time God did make such a distinction. Says Rabbi, I don't understand. This is why God says, I took you out of Egypt. This is a very extreme, unusual circumstance where someone outright says, it's not my money, it belongs to a goy. But, the borrower is keeping the Torah and mitzvot, and he's not participating. Had he known that this is a lie, he wouldn't participate. So that does not include the borrower. The court by which they did the transaction act with the witnesses are also under a grave sin. But here in this case, they are not included in that warning, again, because they're not aware. Right. So you're dealing only one party out of at least four. In addition, it's not always when you charge interest. Sometimes you outright come to court and says, I want to benefit from my money while it's doing whatever it does for this guy. So therefore, says the Rebbe, it's very hard to explain that the reason God is warning us, reminding us that he knows, in Egypt he knew exactly to distinguish between a non-Jewish firstborn and a Jewish firstborn. Therefore, you will be able to tell who is actually charging interest. It applies only to one party out of a minimum of four, and it's only in rare cases. However, this does not explain the connection between the prohibition against interest and the Exodus as a whole, nor the connection between interest and the denial of the yoke of heaven. In addition, says the Rabbi, it doesn't talk about Exodus. It's talking about distinguishing between firstborn, a Jew, and firstborn, non-Jew. But God says, who took you out of Egypt. It doesn't say God who found who is your firstborn. Mm-hmm. Number one. Number two, what about the yoke of heaven? The Sifra says, if you accept interest, you deny God's yoke. What does God's yoke have to do with it? There are commentators who explain that by lending money to a fellow Jew without interest and without seeking to make a profit, a Jew demonstrates his trust in God and his acceptance of the yoke of heaven. He willingly fulfills the command to help a Jew without profiting thereby. By contrast, when a person lends money at interest, he shows that he does not place his trust in God and thus casts off the yoke of heaven. So some people explain it the following. They say, if you charge somebody without interest, what you do is you are making a public demonstration, public display that you trust that God will take care of you. What happens if you charge interest? You are denying that God runs the show. You're trying to profit when God said not so. And therefore, God is not running the show. That's why you accept God's yoke by fulfilling this mitzvah. You deny God's yoke by disobeying God. Says the Rebbe, nevertheless, this interpretation requires much clarification. The Rebbe says there are many problems with this explanation. It places the emphasis on the person's trust in God, or lack of it, and not on his acceptance or rejection of the yoke of heaven. It doesn't say, I am you God, trust me. It says, I am you God, you Lord. In other words, the Sifra says you're accepting the yoke of God, but that's not the truth based on that. Based on that, you trust in God. You're placing your trust in God, not God's yoke. God's yoke is a different category than God's yoke. And this explanation, it's all about trusting God and not about God's yoke. Number B, this trust or lack of trust is not directly connected with the question of interest, but rather with the mitzvah of performing deeds of kindness. Before mentioning the prohibition against taking interest, the Torah states, when your brother will become impoverished, you should support him. This implies that one should lend this money without gaining a profit. Says the Rebbe, not charging interest, nothing to do with trusting God. It has to do with the fulfillment of the mitzvah of being kind, of having compassion, of assisting someone in need. It's a mitzvah just few lines earlier in the same portion. God says, if someone, one of your brothers, is in a desperate situation, do not ignore and let go, but rather help them, assist them, lend them, find them a job, give them good advice. And that's part of lending money without interest. It's not about trusting God, it's about fulfilling the mitzvah of being kind to the poor. When a person who is concerned about his own livelihood refuses to give an interest-free loan because he desires to do business or earn money with every last penny of his resources, he demonstrates a lack of trust in God. He has not, however, violated the provision against interest, since in that instance he did not offer the poor person the loan. If someone refuses to help somebody because the only way you will help him is by charging interest, making a profit, he's not losing God's trust in God. He is disobeying God with the commandment of helping the poor. So therefore the Rebbe says it does not apply to accepting God's yoke or not and taking you out of Egypt or not.
I don't understand this paragraph where it says he demonstrates a lack of trust in God. If I have money and I want to invest it all, and someone comes in for a loan, I say, I'm sorry, my money is taking care of me. Where's the show
This
lack of trust?
is one scenario, but the other scenario is if the man says to you, I need to buy shoes for my children or pay tuition, and I don't know where to turn. Are you able to assist me for about 6 months? I'm going to get the IRS refund and then I'll pay you back. If I'm able to, I am obligated to assist without interest.
But you're telling me a specific.
And you are telling me a specific, and that's what I don't want to get into because otherwise we'll not cover it. Okay?
Yeah.
Just like before. Chassidut establishes a fundamental principle. The Hasidic teaching of Chabad is doing something very unique about our relationship with God. Accepting God's yoke, as expressed by the observance of the mitzvot, implies more than submission to God's will. It involves a proactive willingness to participate in His service, and that calls forth a similar response from above. God takes an active role in a Jew's divine service. This is expressed by the well-known interpretation of the blessing recited before fulfilling a mitzvah. We say, Asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav. He sanctified us with His commandment. What do you mean, mitzvotav, His commandment? B'mitzvot, with commandments. His commandment, praising God who sanctified us with His commandments. That is, as is well known, the mitzvot we observe are His mitzvot. He also fulfills them. When we have a mitzvah of reading the Megillah, even though it's rabbinic, you might say, when we have a mitzvah to celebrate Shabbat, God is performing those mitzvot, and He was kind enough to share them with us so we can emulate God's behavior. And that's why before you do a mitzvah, before you eat matzah, we say Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav. Before you circumcise a child, before you marry a wife, you say Asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al ha'arayot. All everything else is there are a few words you said before. We thank you, God, our Lord, who sanctified us with His commandments. Meaning, He performed the commandments and He was kind enough to share with us those commandments. This is the Hasidic interpretation to the reward of Asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav. There are two dimensions to this dynamic. It's divided into two ways. A, God fulfills the mitzvot before the Jewish people, as reflected in our sage's statement. What He does, He commands Israel to do. One is God performed those mitzvot. He puts on tefillin, He celebrates Shabbat, He performed the mitzvah of honor thy father and mother. He performs every single mitzvah because it's edicts that he follows, he also was kind enough to share them with his chosen people. B, he observes the mitzvot in response to the observance of the mitzvot by the Jewish people. As reflected in our sage's statement, whenever a person studies the Torah, the Holy One, blessed be He, studies opposite him. This applies not only regarding Torah study, but also to the observance of the other mitzvot. Another way of looking at it is that anytime I perform a mitzvah, right in front of me, God sits and performs the same mitzvah. And therefore, it's His commandment. In other words, God promises, if you lend money to somebody, I will do kindness to that person. If you are celebrating Shabbat, I will celebrate Shabbat. If you are lenient and take any leniency before executing somebody in court, I will take the same leniency before the time of execution comes. I will be reflecting, just a mirror, reflecting your behavior. So we have two in one understanding of what does it mean in God's commandments. The first is God performs them and He was kind enough to share them with us. The second is God tells us, I will reflect your behavior. Anytime you do a mitzvah, I will do the same. Of course, the fact that our deeds prompt God to fulfill the mitzvot is no indication that we are independently capable of causing God to act, because there is no comparison between our fulfillment of the mitzvot and His. After all, a created being is utterly uncomparable to the Creator. Rather, this process of causation is possible only because God desired that our deeds influence Him, so to speak. In other words, what Rabbi says is, when you perform the mitzvot, it's totally different than the way God performed the mitzvot, because I am not always perfect. You won't find every mitzvah that I do, it's just perfect with all aspects. When God does it, it is perfect. All that we say, therefore the correlation, the comparison is not exactly the same. However, it is clearly God's is a reflection of me. When I perform, God acts the same. This requires explanation. Why, indeed, does God want a divine service to mere mortals to exert influence in the spiritual realms, despite there being no comparison between them and Him? The first phase of the dynamic, that is, that His observance of the mitzvot bring about our observance, can be understood. His deeds generate the potential for us to fulfill the mitzvot. But what is the explanation for the second phase, that our observance prompt His? The Rabbi says the first one, that God was kind enough, whatever He does, He enabled us to do. We can understand. We're not going to be perfect. We're not going to do it exactly the way God does it, but at least we can emulate, we can try to follow. But the second explanation is God mirrors our deeds. In other words, when I'm saying kind words to somebody, God will act in the same way. When I study Torah, God studies Torah. Why? Why God chose to do the exact same? B, it's impossible to perfectly mirror my behavior or my study, because my is a mere iota of doing it close to being properly done. When God does it and reflecting my deeds or my study, He does it 100%. The distance between created beings and the Creator is so vast, it's immeasurable. So therefore, to say that God mirrors my behavior, if I know the distance between the two, calls to question how is it possible and for what reason. To understand the above, I hope we're not going too far. I will summarize everything we went through as soon as we get to the answer. This is explaining something deep in Kabbalah that will enable to answer the question we started. To understand the above, several basic questions must be first answered. Why is divine service necessary at all? Why not let God provide us with everything through an arousal from above, as reflected in His beneficence? In other words, why does God say, you want to have long life? Honor your father and mother. You want to benefit from my benevolence? Keep Shabbat. Why? Why shouldn't God, He's kind? Let Him share and release and give. as is well known, the world was created because of divine initiative to act benevolently to his created beings. The reason God created the universe is because he wanted to give. He wanted to be kind. So he needed somebody that's separated, so to say, from God, so he can act in kindness. That's the whole purpose of the universe, for God to be able to act in kindness. If it's so, why do I have to work for it? What's wrong with just giving without any investment? Since God is the ultimate good, and it is the nature of the benevolent to act kindly, why shouldn't he grant his creations everything they need without his benevolence being dependent on their service? Why is this that God will give us only when I do the right thing? What's wrong with giving without? Just have a bank account with endless number, and you can always go, like mining bitcoins. You can always go there and get as much as you want, go on a cruise, enjoy the nicest, fanciest meal, always hire the best caterers, pay your dues to synagogue, the VIP number, so you're going to get an aliyah every Shabbat. Do whatever. Why does we have to have a give and take situation? In response, to answer it, Hasidus explained, the Hasidic teaching ends and explains that the ultimate expression of kindness is to have the recipient earn the good which he receives. A true kindness is not gifting, but allowing someone to earn it. A gift dispensed gratis without the recipient having earned it is regarded as bread of shame. Since it is the nature of the benevolent to act kindly, God desires to give the Jews the ultimate good. Therefore, he structured the world in such a manner that they earn divine influence. Did you understand that? Giving someone a gift is not the best kind act. Why? We call it bread of shame. Everything you get for free, you despise it. At first, I'm sure everybody will enjoy it and loves it, but after a while you say, everything I get, it doesn't make sense. We do not enjoy it anymore. You know what true joy? Sweat and hardship. If I earn something with the sweat of my brow and I get paid, or I planted and something grew in the field, I will enjoy it way better than someone that was given to me by gift, as a gift. And that's a true, ultimate act of kindness. Don't give as free as a gift, but give after the recipient has earned it. He has the right to it. That's why the Mishnah teaches us that someone would rather 1 pound of tomatoes or vegetables in his garden than 9 pounds that he purchased in the store. This is even if he pays for it. There is no appreciation. The body will not digest it and benefit from the nutritions of something purchased as much as if something grew after much toil and hardship. We all understand that. Special need children who need so much attention, so much invention, so much investment, they bring joy and deep happiness to those who care, parents, siblings, way more than an ordinary child. No one is debating it. And the reason is, it's a gift, bread of shame, versus invested earning. So if I get something free without investment, it is not the ultimate benevolence by the giver. Rather, he says you got to earn it. Go to work, get up early, accept upon yourself to listen to someone disrespecting you and keep your mouth shut. Learn to honor your father and mother, even if they have crazy ideas that they are demanding of you. When that happens, God will reward us. Then we earned it. If we earned it, it's the ultimate good. On this basis, we can appreciate why the Jews' divine service impacts the spiritual realms above. Were a person to receive payment for work which did not benefit his employer, the payment would be tainted. it would still be considered bread of shame. When the recipient knows that the work for which he is being paid is of no consequence, he feels that he does not deserve any reward. He had not truly earned it. However, for this reason, God structured existence in such a way that the divine service of the Jewish people has an effect in the spiritual realms, bringing about a spiritual equivalent to the mitzvot performed on earth. Consequently, the reward Jews receive is not bread of shame, but payment received for doing something of value to God, recompense well earned for their service. Did you understand that? That's why God structured the universe. He says, you know what? When you do mitzvah, I do the same. In other words, you're able to impact God with your action. If it was God said, go and keep Shabbat, go and honor your father and mother, you're asking, why God cares about that? It's anyway not changing God, not affecting God. And that will become a bread of shame in sort of. That's why God says, you know what, when you study Torah, I study Torah too. When you keep Shabbat, I keep Shabbat. When you honor your father and mother, you keep kosher, you guarding your tongue from speaking inappropriately, I do the same. Now you know you're affecting God. You're affecting God. It's not a bread of shame. It's actually fully earned. Another reason, it's very fascinating, and I want to share that with you, even though we're short of time. It's another reason why God wanted us to know that He perform the mitzvot every time we do. There is another dimension to the above concept. When a task is not productive, a worker will not derive any satisfaction from his labor, even if he is amply rewarded. He will work, but without energy or pleasure. The task will become burdensome, backbreaking toil. Says the Rebbe, there is another reason. If you knew that the work, the hardship that you go through has no purpose and no greatness, then you lack the energy of the joy and the energy that should be infused every time you do a mitzvah. Here is the example. My revered father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe, illustrated this concept with an allegory. A landowner once asked a peasant to work for him. The peasant would harvest grain, but instead of swinging his sickle in the field, he would swing it in the landlord's drawing room. The landlord promised to pay generously for the work. At first the peasant eagerly agreed, but soon begged to be relieved, explaining that he had nothing to show for his work. I do not see that I have done what I've done. Similarly, imagine the landowner has plenty of money. He calls the peasant and says, I want you to work for me. I want you to take a sickle and make all the motions like you cutting wheat or barley or whatever greens. But I don't want you doing it in the field. I want you to do it in front of me. I enjoy seeing somebody do it. That is, what do you call someone who has an unusual desire or derived pleasure from something that's unusual? He has a meshugas. Yeah. And the man says he's going to pay generously. He's doing it under air conditioner. So what else can be wrong? He started doing it. After 5 minutes, he said, I'm sorry, I'm quitting. He says, quitting? Why? He says, because I don't see the results of my Torah. In the field, I look back and says, look how much I've done.
Right.
Here, I don't see it. I'm cutting air. Mm-hmm. Cutting air, it's impossible. Why? Because it's purposeless. Everything we do must have a purpose. Either imaginary or real, it doesn't matter. We must have a purpose. If you do not see a purpose for your toil, you will not be able to. You lose the energy. That's the nature of the beast. Therefore, God says to us, when you study Torah, I study Torah too. Otherwise, we would say, what's the purpose? And after a while, we would be feel that we waste our time and lose all the energy, drained completely and unable to perform. So that's the second reason. The first reason is the true benevolence is when you reward something after they invested. They work hard. And therefore God says, when you do something, it affects me too. So therefore, you are rewarded for making God study Torah, do the mitzvot. The second reason is, in order for one to have the energy to perform God's commandments, there must be a possibility to see a results. If you do it plain in the air and no results, you will quit very quickly, even if the reward is very high. And the reason is because we must feel there is a purpose. And therefore, the purpose is that God Himself is sitting and studying Torah and performing the mitzvot. Similarly, God structured existence in a manner such that a Jew's service would have spiritual impact above. When a Jew sees that the divine service is productive, that it evokes a similar response in the spiritual realms, this knowledge infuses his efforts with energy and satisfaction, giving him the power to overcome the challenges posed by the evil inclination. He is inspired, knowing that his divine service affects the very essence of God as it were. Now we can go into interest. Interest is at the core that is totally against the whole idea of connecting to God, and God is reflecting my behavior. All the divine influence felt in this world depends on the divine service of the Jewish people. Every mitzvah has a unique impact. For the expression of a particular mitzvah in the spiritual realms is dependent on the fulfillment of that mitzvah by the Jewish people. The same is true in a more general sense. The very fact that the divine service of the Jewish people has an effect on the spiritual realms is also a function of the divine service, and in particular is reflected in the divine service involved in the observance of the mitzvah prohibition of interest, prohibiting interest. Here is how the Rebbe is connecting it. Says the Rebbe, what is interest? Receiving profit for lending money. That is, the lender derives a gain because the money lent once belonged to him. True, presently the money is no longer his. It has now been transferred to the domain of the borrower. Nevertheless, by having lent the borrower his money, the lender enables the borrower to do business, and in the lender's mind, that is reason enough for the borrower to pay him interest. So, Rabbi, what's his interest? I give you money. That money, before I address this, will address any of you. I'm sure the questions will come up. That money is gone as soon as you start using it. Unlike renting a car, when I rent you a car, you have to return the same car. So that car that you're using and driving around town is still mine. Therefore, it makes sense that I derive benefit. When I lend you money, I did a mitzvah by assisting you. Now I want to get paid for what? Not for doing something now, but for something I've done 2 weeks ago. And that defies the exact relationship that exists between us and God. That every time you do something, God will do in return. And you're not going to get bread of shame. You're not going to get for free. We are trying to gain for free. We're trying to get rewarded or paid for something we're not doing, and it's not ours anymore. The money is owed to you. But the money is not yours, because the very concept of money is that it has to exchange hands. Right now, I lend you $100, you owe me $100, but that $100 is not mine anymore. It was mine when I gave it to you. Now, a day later, you want me to be paid for what I have done before. It's called free reward, which defies the very essence of God's creation of heaven and earth.
Don't we expect to be rewarded in heaven for our good deeds done
That
today?
we're continuously doing.
We're gonna
So if I
reward-
lend you money and you use the money for paying debt or for starting a business, God will reward us for the 30 days loan, for the 60 days loan, for whatever long, and if 60 days has passed and he says, I'm sorry, I don't have the money, give me an extension, and you do, without charging interest, you actually are being kind to your borrower, and for that you get rewarded. So quite the opposite. Yes?
You're talking about doing something, being rewarded for something you did prior.
Right.
Is wrong.
It's very wrong.
Yet we spend our lives
Oh, he's talking
doing
about
good deeds
in the world to
be
come.
rewarded in the world to come, which is doing something now to be rewarded later. That's kind of the whole.
I don't understand. You hire an employee to plow your field. Do you pay him every second? You pay him at the end of the month. You hire a subcontractor, a plumber, to fix the plumbing in the building. Are you going to pay him every day, or are you going to pay him when he finishes the project? When the inspectors...
You pay him when he's done the work. I mean,
That's
that's
it.
Torah.
That's the reward and the world to come when you finish your project. I don't understand the question. What is interest? Receiving profit for lending money, that is, the lender derive a gain because the money lent once belonged to him. True, presently the money is no longer his. It has now been transferred to the domain of the borrower. Nevertheless, by having lent the borrower his money, the lender enables the borrower to do business, and in the lender's mind, that is reason enough for the borrower to pay him interest. Thus, observing the prohibition against interest means taking profit only for money that is presently still the lender's. This is also the dynamic underlying the heter iska, financial arrangement where a certain portion of the loan is considered an investment. That's why you're allowed to benefit from your money. If you make a contract between you and the borrower that you are a partner in his investment with the money that you put in, now you're not charging for something you did in the past. It's your money who is earning you a benefit. A financial arrangement where a certain portion of the loan is considered an investment, allowing the lender or the investor the opportunity to receive a guaranteed return from his money in a heter iska. A certain portion of the money that changes hands remains the lender's. It is merely entrusted to the borrower. Thus, when the borrower does business with the funds, he is also doing business with the share belonging to the lender, and the profit the lender receives is thus earned solely from the money which actually still belongs to him. Similar principles apply with regards to the renting of animals or utensils. That's why you are allowed to have heter iska, a contract between borrower and lender, where the lender has shares in the investment. Therefore, it's his money still. It's his money that works, that purchases goods and sells them. And by doing so, what you do is your money still earns you money. But if you just lend it to him to pay his debt, to pay a loan, there is no share. The money is gone. Earning for it now is asking for a free gift, which defies the very principles by which the universe exists. A Jew's conduct towards a fellow Jew is mirrored in how God conducts himself towards him. If a Jew transgresses the prohibition against interest, that is, if he presently makes a profit only because he lent his fellow Jew money previously, a similar pattern is followed by God in relation to him. There is no present and active investment from above in his divine service. He is only provided with initial resources, that is, the mitzvot are fulfilled in the spiritual realms before he begins his divine service, endow him with power to carry out his service, but he is given no more than that. The second dimension mentioned previously, that God sits and studies opposite him, divine energy elicited through man's observance, is lacking. Says the Rebbe, simple as that. If you are going to benefit from something you did in the past, God also is not going to provide you with energy and spirituality from it's what you do, because he's going to say, you have done them long ago. Now you're not going to gain from me anything because I want to keep that energy for myself. By contrast, when a person observes the prohibition against interest, God mirrors his actions, investing and partnering with him. Not only does he endows the person with potential before he begins the divine service, but God remains an active partner in his present service, spiritual endeavors. The Holy One, blessed be he, studies opposite him. In this manner, a Jew's divine service has an effect above eliciting God's investment in his effort. If you are keeping the law of interest and you will not charge interest, what you do is you continuously do a mitzvah by lending somebody money. And therefore, at eliciting God, who says, I gave you energy before, but now I'm going to continue giving you energy by starting next to you, by performing the mitzvah you do. On this basis, we can appreciate the connection between the prohibition against interest, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven, and the exodus from Egypt. The prohibition against interest is of all-embracing significance. Its observance calls forth God's active partnership in one's divine service, a response to man's proactive acceptance of God's yoke, expressed through the fulfillment of mitzvot. And by establishing such a connection with God, a person is granted divine influence that enables them to transcend all limitation, the spiritual counterpart to the exodus of Egypt. Now we can understand why it connects to Egypt. What happened when we left Egypt? We get out of slavery into freedom. You know what true freedom? A real connection that is between us and God. And that is established when you acknowledge that you don't want to get anything for free, but earn it by investing. When you invest, God in return wants you to have a benevolence reward, and he's going to give you for the investment, not for something that you earned before. When you act the same way towards a fellow man, you have left Egypt, you became a free person, and you are accepting God's yoke. You are bringing God to your life. And that's the reason this mitzvah is so unique, says the Rebbe, that God says, I am your God, who took you out of Egypt, to be your Lord, to be your God. Because by keeping the mitzvah of interest, you demonstrate the whole dynamic of God's creation of the universe, and that we can say, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, God sanctifies in his commandment, either because he performed it before and he gives it to us, or because he's sitting and mirroring our behavior, continuously investing in us, and not trying to say, I've done that before, now you go on your own. Thank you very much for
Thank you, Rabbi.
participating.